Did you know that Indigenous peoples are among the most disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against people in many societies? Compared with other groups, they are more likely to be negatively impacted by development projects like mining, including being resettled or completely dispossessed of their traditional lands and losing access to their natural resources that often support their livelihoods. Before each day is over, it is likely that an Indigenous homeland somewhere in the world will be strip-mined, clear-felled, or completely lost, for example from the flooding caused by construction of a dam. Although the rights of Indigenous peoples have received greater legal recognition in recent years, their culture, way of life, and land continues to be under great threat, particularly from extractive resource projects. The global demand for minerals and fossil fuels, coupled with the fact that much of what remains of the world's natural resources is located in the territories of Indigenous peoples, has resulted in ever-increasing impacts on their lives. But is it accurate to say that extractive industries are certain to adversely impact the lives of Indigenous peoples, or that all Indigenous peoples reject the opportunities that mining projects can bring? Certainly, when Indigenous peoples are given little or no say in whether and how activities take place on their lands, it is not surprising that they reject projects and that there are negative impacts. However, some argue that when governments and companies engage with Indigenous peoples meaningfully and listen to and respect their aspirations about development, extractive industries have the potential to bring significant benefits. The question for governments, companies, and others is, how and under what conditions can mining benefit Indigenous peoples? And should Indigenous peoples be allowed to say no to development projects on their land? So, who are Indigenous peoples and what makes someone Indigenous? The term Indigenous peoples is generally used to refer to the descendants of pre-colonial peoples of the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. However, Indigenous peoples exist in most regions of the world. It has been estimated that there are around 370 million Indigenous peoples living in around 90 countries. Although there is no single definition of Indigenous peoples, the United Nations, among others, has identified Indigenous peoples to have the following characteristics in varying degrees. They self-identify as members of a distinct Indigenous cultural group, and their identity is recognized by other members of the community. They have a historical connection with a given region prior to colonization or annexation, and have strong links to territories and natural resources in that region. Next, they maintain, at least in part, distinct social and political systems, as well as distinct dialects, languages, belief systems, and knowledge systems. They are resolved to maintain their identity and social, cultural, and economic and political institutions as distinct peoples. And finally, they are from non-dominant sections of society. Resource development projects can impact Indigenous peoples in much the same way as non-Indigenous people. However, certain characteristics of Indigenous peoples make them particularly susceptible to the negative impacts of mineral resource development. These include their special connection to and reliance on land and resources, the often intimate connection between their identity and cultural heritage in their land, the fact that they often experience greater disadvantage and discrimination than dominant segments of society. For example, if a large open-cut mine requires population resettlement, this can cause particular distress to Indigenous peoples, whose very cultural identity and spiritual well-being may be connected to the land and special sites located there. Or, if a new road or other infrastructure is built into the territory of an Indigenous group, this can result in large-scale, uncontrolled immigration, competition for resources, and social tensions between Indigenous peoples and migrants. There are numerous other ways in which, if not managed appropriately, extractive industries can have particularly harmful impacts, both direct and indirect, on Indigenous peoples. These impacts range from economic and physical displacement to social dislocation and erosion of cultural values due to the rapid pace of economic change. In recent years, there has been greater national and international recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, including within the United Nations human rights system. Two of the most important human rights instruments for Indigenous peoples are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and International Labour Organization Convention No. 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, also referred to as ILO 169. Key rights articulated in these instruments include the right to self-determination, which means that Indigenous peoples have the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, their right to own, possess, and use the land and resources located in their traditional territories, the right to maintain their cultures and identities, and their right to give their free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, for projects on their lands. We will discuss FPIC in greater detail shortly, given the considerable attention it has received from Indigenous groups, NGOs, industry, governments, and other stakeholders. This growing recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples has been accompanied by increased awareness of the need to ensure Indigenous peoples are not only protected from the harmful aspects of extractive projects, but that they derive meaningful benefits. The way in which companies engage with Indigenous peoples is of critical importance here. In many respects, engaging with Indigenous peoples is the same as with any stakeholder group. It requires mutual understanding and respect between parties, making sure people are fully informed about a project, ensuring all voices are heard in a community, and addressing people's concerns. However, there are important differences, most notably the need to engage with Indigenous peoples through their traditional decision-making structures and processes, while bearing in mind that these structures may also reinforce any existing disadvantage faced by particular individuals or groups such as women. Typically, in traditional decision-making structures, elders and other community leaders play a key role in decision-making processes. These often involve a consensus-based approach that entails participatory group consultation, negotiation, and mediation. Decisions often take longer to make than in Western context and usually require following cultural protocols. These decision-making processes can present challenges for mining companies who often operate with strict time constraints to achieve objectives under project milestones, and decisions are often reached based on time and cost efficiency. Nevertheless, failure to engage respectfully using traditional structures and processes can lead to the breakdown of relationships that may never be fully repaired. Conversely, by showing respect for these structures and processes, companies can build trust and mutual understanding, which is more likely to lead to positive outcomes and build their social license to operate. There are some important principles companies should be aware of when engaging with Indigenous peoples. For example, it may be necessary to build community capacity to engage, so that people are able to understand in terms they are familiar with what the impacts of a project are likely to be and what their rights are. Another is that engagement with Indigenous people should be meaningful. At its most basic, this means ensuring Indigenous peoples are able to voice their concerns and preferences before decisions are made on matters that may affect them, and companies should take all reasonable steps to address the issues that have been raised and agree with communities on a way forward. In an increasing number of cases, engagement with Indigenous peoples involves negotiating actual agreements. These negotiated agreements are particularly common in Canada and Australia, where formal recognition of customary use and ownership has led to the creation of strong statutory frameworks. Agreements between Indigenous peoples and companies establish the terms and conditions under which projects will proceed, though not necessarily whether projects can proceed. Negotiated agreements provide an opportunity for Indigenous peoples to not only obtain compensation for the disruptions and the impacts of resource extraction, but also, in ideal cases, opportunities for sustainable development. Agreements are required by law in some countries and jurisdictions, but are also increasingly being established on a voluntary basis by companies. In Australia, the Native Title Act of 1993 promotes agreement making by giving a right to negotiate to traditional owners, establishing procedures for registering and giving legal effect to agreements, and providing an alternative legal avenue if agreement cannot be reached. Agreements are often an outcome of FPIC, which we'll discuss in a minute, but may be established without an FPIC process being followed. In other words, just because an agreement has been established doesn't mean to say a community has given its full consent for a project to proceed on its land. So, what are the benefits for Indigenous peoples with agreements? For one, they entail direct financial contributions such as payments to individuals and/or groups. Second, agreements may entail the creation of trusts and funds that can be used to support sustainable development for Indigenous communities. 3, agreements may require that employment opportunities be given to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous contractors. They may also require the awarding of supply contracts to Indigenous-owned businesses or local content, and where these may not exist, supporting the creation of Indigenous businesses. They may involve establishing local training programs to ensure Indigenous peoples have the capacity to take up opportunities and advance their careers. And agreements may entail building and/or improving infrastructure and services which can be used during a project and after it is ended, for example, power lines, roads, ports, and sewage systems. There is an increasing expectation that companies not only meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples through their traditional decision-making processes or negotiate agreements with them, but also seek their free, prior, and informed consent to conduct activities on their lands, particularly if those activities are likely to have significant adverse impacts, such as requiring resettlement. So, what is FPIC? There's no universally accepted definition, but it is commonly understood that FPIC refers to a process whereby Indigenous peoples are free to make a choice about whether and how activities occur in their land, a choice that is based on sufficient and timely information about the benefits and disadvantages of a project and using their traditional decision-making systems. There are 4 basic elements of FPIC. The first is that decision-making processes are free, meaning people are able to make decisions without coercion, intimidation, or manipulation. The second is that it should occur prior to project decisions being made and before impacts occur, meaning people are given sufficient time to be involved in decision-making processes. The third is that people are fully informed about a project and its impacts and the various perspectives about the project, both positive and negative. The fourth is that there are effective processes for Indigenous peoples to give or withhold their consent, consistent with their customary traditional decision-making processes, and that their decisions are respected and upheld. FPIC is provided for under Article 10 of UNDRIP, which states that Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without their free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. However, although UNDRIP has been signed by most countries in the world, it is not legally binding. Nevertheless, FPIC is no longer an unrealistic goal for Indigenous peoples, but is an increasingly accepted and expected principle that has been adopted as policy by intergovernmental organizations and industry bodies alike, including the IFC and the International Council on Mining and Metals. However, while there is general consensus on the need for consultation and decision-making to be free, prior, and informed, the concept of consent is not universally accepted. For some, FPIC is understood as the right to veto a project, while for others, it is understood as a principle which decision-making processes should aim to achieve. These differing interpretations of what FPIC actually means have led to intense debate. Critics of the FPIC as principle approach, who include Indigenous peoples' rights groups, argue that without the right to say no to a project, FPIC means little, and that Indigenous peoples are denied their fundamental right to self-determination. Proponents of the FPIC as principle approach, such as the IFC, suggest that there are often significant practical challenges to applying FPIC, such as securing consent from every group that might be impacted by a project. And while consent is a desirable outcome, what is important is undertaking meaningful engagement to achieve this goal. Meaningful engagement involves A. Indigenous peoples being able to voice their concerns, aspirations, and preferences before decisions are made on matters that may affect them. And B, a company taking all reasonable steps to respond to and address the issues that have been raised and reach agreement with communities on a way forward. The issue of FPIC is certainly not black and white. Is there any value in following an FPIC as principle approach when Indigenous peoples do not have the right to veto a project? The likes of the ICMM and IFC would argue there is, because the process of meaningfully engaging to obtain their consent can be empowering for Indigenous peoples and thus lead to better development outcomes. Proponents of this approach also point to cases in countries where FPIC is legally mandated, such as the Philippines, but where the process has been manipulated by state actors in an attempt to ensure consent is achieved. For example, in the Zamboanga Peninsula in the Philippines, home to around 300,000 people from the Subanan Indigenous group, the government conducted an FPIC process in order to obtain consent for mining, including for a project to be run by a Canadian company. Among the many problems with the FPIC process applied were the attempts by the government to set up a council of elders that did not reflect the wishes of the people, and the selection of only some groups to participate in the process. Meanwhile, other Indigenous leaders experienced harassment by security forces. In response, the Subanen filed a complaint against the company and also developed their own FPIC protocol. The people eventually decided against mining in their territory and also ruled that no further mining applications would be considered until the community decided otherwise. There's no question that the pursuit of consent without meaningful engagement is deeply problematic. But is it just as problematic to pursue FPIC as a process with meaningful engagement, but one which does not confer the right of veto? The IFC and industry as a whole would argue that in practice, even if the right to veto is not conferred to Indigenous peoples, companies would risk losing or failing to gain a social license to operate, conflict-causing delays, and broader reputation damage, and so would be unlikely to go ahead with a project anyway. Finally, there is also an argument that although it may be desirable to give Indigenous peoples the right to veto projects, states face many challenges in balancing the interests of Indigenous peoples or other minority groups with those of the broader population. What do you think?